This is the VO2 Lounge, and today we're going to be covering the Norwegian training method. Norway has a population of approximately 5.4 million people, depending when you're listening to this. In comparison, the UK has a population of approximately 68 million. In the USA, we have to go as far down as the 23rd most populated state of South Carolina at 5.3 million to find a state less populated than Norway. Yet they have some of the very They have some very impressive athletes, to say the least, such as Jakob Ingebrigtsen winning Olympic gold in the 1500 meter and holds multiple world records on indoor running, Kristian Blummenfelt winning Olympic gold in the triathlon, and Gustav Iden winning the Ironman World Championships. And if we go back a little, something like the 1980s, we can see this is not a modern phenomenon, with 9 times NYC marathon champion Gret Waits and former 5K, 10K and marathon world record holder Ingrid Kristiansen. So what is it? They're training the lucky genetics of a generation, or just something in the water? Now, we've got 2 generations of athletes here, so that somewhat rules out that, but there could still be something in the water. Well, multiple people have been asking this for some time, calling it the Norwegian training method of training that is resulting in this sort of anomaly of some description. I personally had not been too bothered to investigate myself until more and more videos started popping up about the Norwegian training method, including one by Dylan Johnson, and then more recently a podcast episode on the drive interviewing Oliver Alexander Boo, who is the coach of both Kristian Blummenfelt and Gustav Iden, and talks in great depth about what the methodology is, what it means to be following the Norwegian training method. And it just made me want to look back a little bit and look some of the historic stuff, and then I came across some very interesting articles, which essentially we are going to go over today. So what is the Norwegian training method, and what's its history? Now, how do we learn about their training? Well, much is documented on YouTube in various forms. However, there are a great number of articles by Marius Becken, a former long and middle distance runner who competed between 800 meters and 10,000 meters, or the 10K, and the World Championship and Olympic level. Let's take a look at these articles. But before we do, I have a small announcement. I've been considering this for some time now over the course of producing these podcast episodes, and I've been working on a bit of a framework, but essentially I'm in the process of launching a coaching service. This current point is specifically going to be for cyclists. However, there is plans that long term maybe I can include other forms of aerobics/endurance sports, but for now it will just be cycling. If you are interested, my email will be in the description, which is the vo2lounge@gmail.com. That's THEVO2LOUNGE@gmail.com, where you can send a simple email registering your interest, which can be as simple as saying I'm interested, or can be more long form with a bit of a bio and some information as to what you would like to gain from the training and what your long-term goals are. As a heads up, initially I'll be limiting this to 10 athletes to help manage my own workload along with other work commitments and ensure that you, the athlete, get the best experience possible. Anyway, I'll leave it there for now. Email if you're interested. The first article or blog post is titled A Practical Guide from Theory to Workouts, with a nice starting quote of using our technical advantages to copy their training principle. There is referring to Kenyans, of course. I mean, who else would you want to imitate when it comes to running performance, essentially? The blog provides a detailed account of the author's experience with implementing the lactate acid meter in a training program initiated by the Norwegian Olympic Committee. So this initially was a driver by their Olympic Committee. The primary objective of this program was to educate promising middle and long distance athletes on the significance of training a specific intensity level. This initiative stemmed from earlier studies that highlighted the training methodologies of Kenyan athletes who were observed to train around their lactate threshold, LT, the point at which lactic acid starts to accumulate in the bloodstream. So the point when you would be able to measure it in the blood using one of these lactate meters. You can look them up. Just for some clarity, Lactate Pro 2 is a device that resembles a portable glucose meter. That's the easiest way to kind of feel like a lot of people may have seen these, that a diabetic would use to check blood glucose levels, or a perfectly healthy individual who just wants to see what their blood glucose level are in response to different foods or resting glucose levels and so on. But similar to a glucose meter, the athlete will prick themselves, often the earlobe rather than say a finger prick, and collect the blood with a strip that will then feed back on the blood lactate meter. So you need, again, the strip and the device. It's also worth mentioning a snippet on what lactate actually is, as there are some misconceptions about it. For many years, it has been thought that lactate was just a waste product as a result of anaerobic exercise, that being exercise without air to some extent. In actual fact, we know that lactate formation can occur under aerobic conditions, and lactate production is the result of glucose utilization by the muscle cells under aerobic conditions. So essentially, lactate is always present as a result of glucose utilization. It's just in some cases it remains within the muscle rather than going to the blood to other surrounding peripheries. We also know that lactate is not a waste product. It's actually the most important gluconeogenic precursor, essentially meaning the formation of new glucose production, essentially, in the body. About 30% of all glucose we use during exercise is derived from lactate recycling to glucose. So the elites, essentially, where an untrained individual is going to produce lactate and not be able to shuttle it back into the muscle, carry out gluconeogenesis and reuse essentially that product, it's just going to go straight into the bloodstream and cause, it can be sometimes where you get like an ache in another part of the body or like a burn in another part of the body as this, the hydrogen ion specifically, this is coming out and flowing around the body essentially as it needs to be disposed of by some other working muscle or the brain or anything else that's willing to utilize. Now this you can see, and parts of this have been taken from a Training Peaks article by Inigo San Millan, who a lot of people will be aware of from his appearances on countless podcasts like The Drive, and then he has also been on the GCN show / just GCN have done some interviews with him, and there are numerous ones. And he himself, I believe now, also has some form of YouTube channel where he's distributed some additional bits of information and summarized a lot of the things that he is talking about. More, not that they're not technical, they are incredibly technical, but I think the content on his channel is obviously far more focused. There's no other individual he's interacting with. He is just getting across the information in an uninterrupted format. So it's well worth a look into, along with the Training Peaks article if you're more interested. Now, back to the previous article where we were talking about lactate and lactate meters. So the article underscores the pivotal role of lactate acid meters in precisely measuring training intensity. That is what the tool is being used to measure. It suggests that by adopting a training regime akin to that of Kenyan athletes, focusing on training near the LT, athletes could potentially enhance their performance significantly. The recommended approach involves incorporating lactate threshold sessions into training routines with durations ranging from 36 to 60 minutes. Don't know why 36, very specific, and gradually increasing intensity throughout. The text it kind of cautions against excessive training at or above LT, lactate threshold, which could lead to overtraining and hinder performance improvements. It emphasizes the importance of maintaining discipline by training slightly below this threshold, with occasional intervals designed to push the boundaries of the threshold. The discussion extends to track sessions where specific lactate levels are recommended for different types of workouts, providing athletes with a framework to optimize their training. Now, the passage also addresses the choice between using lactate meters and heart rate monitors, arguing in favor of the former due to the consistency of LT levels compared to the variability of heart rate. Now, I think that it's important to sort of note that it's lactate also, to some extent, because we're biological beings, you may not be at the same millimolar level, so like say 2, for the same wattage, for example, if you're a cyclist, every day. However, the actual measurement of that is accurate. So it takes into account daily variations, and because you're always working to that, you're not going overboard. Whereas heart rate is arguing that it can fluctuate a lot, but as a result, because if you're working to heart rate, you may actually be understimulating or overstimulating depending on where that lies, because they deem that these LT levels are a far more reliable and consistent long-term metric of what the training intensity truly is. Common questions and misconceptions regarding the training method of Kenyan athletes are addressed, stressing the need for non-African athletes to leverage technology to match or exceed the performance standards set by their Kenyan counterparts. This I found interesting, as I don't think other sources are suggesting it to be used to train athletes. It does pivot away from it to some extent, and he also mentions that he has done countless, like a huge number of test strips. However, in this first article, it does almost paint the picture of saying that, look, these Kenyans and Africans in general from this region of running stock, they seem to have a natural feel for what this value is, essentially. And they're arguing that Europeans do not naturally, inherently have this ability to do it. So they're using a technological advantage that they suggest they possess in the form of these lactate meters. And now they can use that to train the athlete to know what the feel of a threshold session actually is, and then hopefully come off it and then check periodically. Now, in reality, if you look at least at the Norwegian method that is online at the moment, with previously mentioned triathletes, it looks to be more that they are just consistently using it throughout. Now, whether it's just the stuff you see is like that, and they do in fact actually not wean off it, but don't use it for every session where they're trying to hit a specific target. That would be interesting to know whether it is all the time or not. But this bit of the section almost made me think that this is very cost prohibitive. But not knowing what the second-hand market for these things is like, whether you could actually sort of go on it for a period of time, especially if you're an elite and there is financial incentive to try this method out, buying some strips, doing some testing, getting a picture for how it feels. But then again, I come back to the rate of perceived exertion, and athletes at the elite level tend to be very good at doing this themselves. So do you need this to train you, or is it going to have to be something that you use permanently? I don't know. But this article seems to kind of, skirt around that to some extent. It's suggesting that it is possible. And moving on to the second article, titled The Norwegian Model of Lactate Threshold Training and Lactate-Controlled Approach to Training. Now, I know I've given some history already, but it's just worth noting that the Norwegian runners using lactate meters for intensity control dates back to 1998 initiative. That's when this happened by the Norwegian Athletics Federation on the and the Olympian OLT, basically. This project aimed to optimize training for elite athletes, but controversy over lactate and threshold training led to its short duration. The personal journey during this time, guided by Peter Coe, emphasized a blend of intense training and aerobic conditioning, highlighting the dynamic evolution of training methodologies in and middle distance running. Now, it sounds like this was more jarring then because people seemed to do, maybe it was a bit like cycling where you just lots and lots of volume and less so these kind of structured intervals and threshold work and so on and so forth. But let's go through this article in its different sections. Now, you've got a section on sweet spot training. So sweet spot, he does refer to this as finding your sweet spot, but this is not the same as sweet spot training zone that you will be familiar with if you're a cyclist. Sweet spot training zone is a mathematical assumption based on your FTP or some other metric. So it's kind of fixed. Obviously it's a bound, but it's fixed. Whereas this method is based on testing. The methodology employed by the individual involved measuring, testing and adjusting workouts to optimize training patterns, focusing on and enhancing the aerobic threshold using lactic acid measurements and threshold training. Observed early on that the normal lactate values for elite runners differed significantly from those of non-elite athletes, prompting a shift towards lower lactate levels during sessions, typically ranging from 2.3 to 3 millimole. This adjustment not only yielded better results, but also allowed for increased tolerance to threshold training without experiencing excessive fatigue. So this is again where what the Norwegian method is also about. It's about fatigue minimum. It's almost the maximum effective dose in some extent. It's how do you get as much time in as productive a zone without cooking yourself, essentially. The key takeaways from the approach include elite athletes tend to exhibit lower lab thresholds as they progress. So, which is it's kind of common. It's just as you're becoming essentially more efficient, for lack of a better word, you're utilizing more lactate in the muscle. The point at which your body just physiologically can't keep up a steady state effort, the lactate levels in the blood is no longer essentially the limiting factor, whereas it would be in a less elite individual, I suppose, or the limiting factor of other components is also happening, but lactate, more of it's leaking out into the blood. Kenyan runners often naturally reach optimal lactate levels just without any devices. Different training approaches such as progressive sessions, threshold pushing sessions and floating sessions below the threshold produce positive outcomes at different times. For instance, following altitude training, a more cautious approach with floating sessions below the threshold were preferred, while peak post-altitude periods called for more aggressive threshold work. The methodology involved extended periods of training at a consistent lactate level, followed by careful monitoring and adjustment to find the optimal training intensity. The success of finding this sweet spot was attributed to muscular factors, believed to be the primary limitation to training stress and the main cause for overtraining. By minimizing muscular wear while pushing the threshold high, athletes were able to handle extensive amounts of this type of training effectively. This is where, I think, to some extent, this is where it becomes more apparent why this method of training may be better suited to runners than cyclists. Because running, you have the physical impact. That impact in the session can negatively impact your ability to complete the session, essentially. Say you have 10 intervals that are 4 minutes long and you're trying to get them all done. by interval 6, you could be just muscularly defeated and not be able to complete them, even though aerobically the body's calling for more to achieve the adaptions. So by splitting these up into what you'll see later of these double threshold days, you will notice that that is the reason. Whereas in cycling, it's less possibly of an issue. The fact that there's no impact. Yes, the muscle can be a limiting factor, but is it in the same way? Now, what about running at race pace, which a lot of people do? I think in running, probably more common even at a higher level, where cycling, I feel like you come out of it a bit because, well, one, I raced today and it was 42k an hour for 2.5 hours. I myself cannot do that on my own. It's just not going to happen. So pace isn't really a thing for cycling, but for running, definitely running at race pace. Now, this part of the paper highlights the importance of optimizing the anaerobic threshold for distance runners and challenges the conventional thinking regarding speed training and race-specific work. The author suggests that while it may seem intuitive to train at race pace or faster to improve performance, the true limiting factor for most distance runners is their anaerobic threshold. This threshold represents the point at which the body shifts from primarily aerobic energy production to anaerobic metabolism, leading to the accumulation of lactate in the muscles. Now, if we went back a little bit, obviously this has been adjusted. Now, this article, I believe, is over 10 years old, maybe even 15 years old. So some things have moved on, and anaerobic metabolism and lactate accumulation, clearly we know we've moved on. However, their assumptions here, what they're trying to achieve, has ended up working, and just the wording can slightly change in the fact that lactate is being produced earlier than you think. The point at which it's measurable in the muscle is showing a transition where you are becoming more glycolytic, and then you're just trying to work around a slightly lower portion to ensure that training volume can remain high. The article kind of shows that in the author's experience testing Kenyan athletes and Norwegian runners, indicates that top Kenyan athletes naturally excel at reaching high levels of intensity and have lower lactate accumulation during higher training sessions compared to Norwegian runners. This suggests that genetics factors may play a role in the ability to optimize anaerobic threshold levels. Instead of focusing solely on speed work or race-specific training, the author advocates for prioritizing lactate threshold work combined with high volume of running to optimize physiological processes within the body. This approach aims to improve the body's ability to sustain higher speeds before reaching the anaerobic threshold, essentially, thereby enhancing your overall performance in distance running events like the 5 and 10K, where this is a extremely high intensity bout, but just trying to train at that pace is likely too strenuous and results in a reduced training load and a reduced training stimulus, and therefore a reduced overall race pace at the end of the day. It also emphasizes that while training at race pace may have mechanical benefits, it ultimately does not address the underlying aerobic abilities that are crucial for sustaining performance. That is a good point in the sense that you probably still want to do some race pace work for the mechanical perspective. Going to the race, having not actually spent any time at that pace, is probably counterproductive. However, you're not doing all the work leading into it at that pace. Maybe it's part of your more specialty work where you're trying to, it's very race specific. You're trying to just get the feel for that pace. Volume's coming down anyway. Most of your adaptions have happened. You're just trying to do that fine tuning, get the feel for the race and see where you stand and how it's going to play out. Now, what about double days? This part of the blog describes the author's experimentation with different approaches to maximize threshold training for distance running. He outlines 3 main approaches that are possible. Top-up aerobic mileage weeks. Inspired by Peter Coe's concept of top-up mileage weeks, the author performed every run with a period of 7 to 8 days at around the anaerobic threshold. This was followed by an easier training period to measure the effects. Longer single aerobic threshold sessions. The authors experimented with longer sessions up to 26 kilometers performed at the anaerobic threshold with 2 to 3 sessions weekly. Clustering threshold work into short timeframes. This approach involved doubling up threshold training within a given day, focusing on doing as much threshold work as possible within a specific period. He found that this approach was the most effective, particularly in driving up anaerobic threshold while balancing muscular stress. The author highlights the importance of balancing muscular stress and allowing adequate rest between hard sessions to maintain muscle readiness. They believe that the short rest period between 2 hard sessions allows the muscle to relax and be ready for another session, which is primarily the factor in the effectiveness of this approach. This is where things really might differ, as I mentioned before, for cyclists. We don't have to worry about muscular fatigue in the same way that you think that runners do, meaning that it might be possible to do the same amount of work in one session. Say, for example, rather than doing 2 sessions of 4x4, you can probably do 1 session of 8x4. While the approach of clustering threshold work was controversial at the time, the author found it to be highly effective in their training regime. They emphasized the importance of muscle readiness over the physiological factors such as endocrine, cardiovascular, or metabolic symptoms. The approach to doubling up threshold training sessions on specific days allowed for significant improvements in performance, particularly in driving up the anaerobic threshold. While managing muscular stress, they provide insight into dynamic nature of muscle tone and its relevance to optimizing training strategies for distance running. Now, this is still on the topic again, essentially, but it's less so what you guys can do, but more what this guy has done, and that was, there was a bit of a controversy, I think, in here, but supporting the Ingebrigtsen brothers. This part of the blog insight into the training methods and principles adopted by the notable Norwegian distance runners, particularly focusing on the training approach of Bjørnar Kristiansen and Ingebrigtsen brothers Henrik, Philip, and Jakob. The author he goes over and describes how they adopted their training approach based on experimentation and collaboration with coaches like Erik Tugud, who coach Bjørnar Kristiansen and Henrik Ingebrigtsen. They emphasize the importance of lactate threshold training and the systematic doubling up of threshold sessions within a given day, known as double threshold training. The training philosophy centers around anaerobic threshold development, a strong focus on optimizing the anaerobic threshold through specific lactate threshold training sessions, volume and intensity balance, structuring the training week with a combination of threshold sessions, hill work, and strength sessions while managing overall weekly volume, interval-based threshold work, preference for breaking the threshold session into intervals rather than continuous work. That is something that definitely applies to other sports, is rather than trying to run at your, or ride or swim, whatever it is at your threshold, doing those intervals. And that's the basis of interval training, isn't it, essentially? Altitude training, systematic use of altitude training during both base training and peak periods, lactate meter control, monitoring and controlling training intensity using lactate meters, particularly during threshold sessions. He highlights the exceptional performance of the Ingebrigtsen brothers, especially Jakob's, whose 3:28 1500 meter time and Olympic gold at a young age, as a testament to the effectiveness of the training approach. However, there seems to be a bit of a discrepancy between his account of their collaboration with Gert Ingebrigtsen and and it's Ingebrigtsen's portrayal of it. While he suggests a more collaborative and knowledge-sharing relationship, Ingebrigtsen reportedly downplays the extent of their interaction, focusing more on learning from the author's mistakes rather than his successes. A bit of a shun, but I didn't read into this too much. He adds it in the passage, so I thought it would be worth mentioning. Overall, it provides value. There's like a lot of insight here into essentially the pillars of this model. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pillars essentially: anaerobic threshold development, volume and intensity balance, interval-based threshold work, altitude training, and lactate meter control. Moving on to some other notable athletes: Kristian Blummenfelt and Gustav Iden. The success of Norwegian triathlon athletes, notably Kristian Blummenfelt and Gustav Iden, as just mentioned, has drawn attention to their training methodologies, which are also centered around lactate threshold training, coached by Arled Tevinton. At the point of when this was being written, these athletes follow a structured training approach with a strong emphasis on optimizing the anaerobic threshold. The coaching philosophy aligns with the principles outlined in the author's article, focusing on maintaining intensity around lactate threshold levels during training sessions. They typically aim to keep lactate levels between 2.5 and 3 millimole per litre during threshold workouts, which is lower than the conventional benchmark of 4 millimole for anaerobic threshold work. Their training methodology revolves around the following: high volume at low intensity, incorporate a significant volume of training at low intensities to build aerobic base. Threshold training, including substantial work at lactate threshold, or LT2, to improve the anaerobic threshold, which is deemed crucial for triathlon race situations, where it's a much more steady state effort than you would ever see in a bike race, essentially. Intensity control, monitoring lactate levels during threshold workouts to ensure athletes train at the appropriate intensity close to their individual threshold. Periodization, employing standardized periodization, particularly at altitude, with a focus on double threshold sessions and variation in training types around the threshold. Variation specificity, introducing variety in training types while maintaining focus around the lactate threshold, and incorporating sessions from all 3 disciplines of triathlon, swim, bike and run, on certain days. This structured approach to training, combined with the meticulous intensity control and periodization that they follow, has contributed to the success of these Norwegian triathletes on the global stage. But essentially, they're again following the standard approach of you're going to have a lot of volume, but when it comes to their intensity, they are utilizing lactate meters. That is what underpins basically the Norwegian method. It's a more data-driven, measurement-driven, experimentation-driven approach to training that is going to be much more cost prohibitive to the general public than a normal training plan. Even when you look at cycling, you talk about power meters, we're still talking at least a power meter, £250, £300, buy it once, left-hand crank only, job done. You can now get dual-sided for similar sort of price. Batteries, that's it. Whereas this, we're talking a £500 investment for the device initially, and then I think £150 around that number for 20 strips, maybe, something like that. These are one-time use only strips, so it's a very cost-prohibitive method of training if it is to be done to the dot. Now, there is then a moderately long bit to the passage that goes over optimizing the model in general, but I've sort of summarized it into a shorter form to get through the points. So these crucial for effective threshold training points are: focus on threshold training. For a large part of the year, prioritize threshold training sessions combined with occasional X elements. I didn't touch on these before, but the X elements are those sessions that are higher essentially than these threshold workouts. Experiment with treadmill running, And for cyclists experimenting with indoor trainers, using the treadmill running as a tool to control intensity and monitor performance, especially during the summer when outdoor conditions may vary. It's essentially they were using the treadmill sessions as one way of you've got control over speed, incline, the surface, the wind, the temperature, so on and so forth. So it provides an excellent testing method for moving forward. Maintain easy training, so keeping easy training sessions truly easy to allow for adequate recovery and prevent overtraining. Altitude training, which again cost prohibitive for most individuals, but for completeness, incorporate altitude training periods to boost anaerobic threshold and overall performance. Short stays of 5 to 10 days can provide significant benefits, as they've described. Do actually have an episode completely on altitude training and the sort of ins and outs in much greater detail. Balance volume and intensity in the summer. Preserve threshold training during the summer months, but consider reducing volume to keep legs fresh for workouts. Adjust intensity and volume based on race-specific needs and competition schedule. It's essentially meaning that the intensity needs to stay into the race season. However, depending on how many races you have, reducing volume and scattering them in places that make sense where adequate recovery has occurred, essentially. Use intervals for threshold work. Experiment with intervals-based threshold sessions instead of continuous efforts. Shorter intervals, for example, 200 meters, 1,000 meters at specific lactate levels can be effective. Maintain race-specific adaptations. Even during the summer, maintain some race-specific training elements to ensure readiness for competitions. Periodize altitude training. Plan altitude training stays strategically to consider the specific training phases and competition schedules. Aim for a boost in anaerobic threshold and performance during post-altitude peak period. And then individualize the training approach. Understand that what works best may vary from individual to individual and the distance that they are intending to compete at. Experiment with different methods to find what optimizes the performance. And again, what epitomizes this strategy is that the outcome is what you're measuring, really. You want to measure lactate, but you also want to measure the performance of the individual and make adjustments based on the performance. If things are going well, trending in the right direction, then maybe you don't need to change anything. You can improve, but more so if things are not going well, this is where you use it to adapt. And that can be where having a schedule with some earlier races can be really useful, or a more populated race schedule, and then being more specific once you've got a good number of races under your belt. I think especially for cycling that can be incredibly important. You can have one season where you just have a big calendar of maybe the season before you did like 5 road races, maybe this season do 15 or 20 and then do another 10 or 15 criteriums just to get a huge amount of racing done that you can then in the following seasons do less work, and you've trialed a lot of different things and you've seen what it does and you've gained that experience. Running less so, fewer races, but having one event in the calendar, you don't know how you're going to react to it because you haven't done any running previously. So maybe that's something to take away if you're someone targeting one singular marathon as your first time. Do some events in the lead up as markers to know where things are trending. So what is your takeaway from all this then? Are you going to employ these double threshold sessions? Are you even going to go out and get yourself a lactate meter? Or are you going to go to a local lab, see if you can get some testing done just for an idea to see what your threshold's at? Especially if you're a cyclist where you can get on the day threshold values, which do vary, but at least it gives you an indication of where things are at. For more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating and sharing the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Share your thoughts or suggest future topics at the vo2lounge@gmail.com or in the VO2 Lounge Discord server. Links all down below. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, it's goodbye.